I call the Honourable Phil Goff.
Mr. Speaker, when that member got to his feet and began to decry the runaway spending habits and the culture and the bad culture of the public service, Mr. Speaker, I thought that was at last a mea culpa. I thought that was at last a mea culpa. The highest paid housing allowances to any beneficiary in the country, thousands of dollars to live in his own home. Thousands of dollars to live in his own home. And if it started off as a bitter speech, Mr. Speaker, we can understand why. The man that got National to 21% in the 2001 election. 21%. And worst of all, Mr. Speaker, this was a leader doing his best who was stabbed in the back by his own current party leader, who promised to support him a night before the party ballot and instead gave his support to Brash. No wonder Bill English is a bitter man in this House. But, Mr. Speaker, I don't want to waste time on Mr. English. I want to talk about what the National Party promised New Zealanders. John Key said the fundamental purpose of his government was to narrow the wage gap with Australia. To narrow the wage gap with Australia, Mr. Speaker, on any measure, the Key-led national government has failed in that purpose. You know, the media were using the figure that the wage gap with Australia had increased by $40 a week since John Key was elected Prime Minister. $40 a week. And John Key came into the House and said, no, it's untrue. It hasn't happened. And he tabled a document. And the document, with the best massaged figures he could provide, showed that the gap had grown by $23 a week. But then, Mr. Speaker, and this is what I objected to most, from Mr. Brownlee and Mr. Key, was the dishonesty of trying to disguise the figures that represented the reality that New Zealand workers are much worse off. And Mr. Key and Mr. Brownlee proudly became the joint holders of the title in the Dominion last Saturday of Wallies of the Week. And let's hear what the Dominion had to say. Mr. Brownlee, for so brazenly claiming that the wage gap with Australia had shrunk under National when by any measure it had grown. When by any measure that it had grown. But wait, there's an even better award for John Key. Joint Wally of the Week for thinking anyone would be fooled by his inept attempt to manipulate the statistics to support Mr. Brownlee. The Wallies of the Week. Well, New Zealanders, Mr. Speaker, are not so easily taken in. They know they are not better off. They know wages are not increasing at the rate of prices, and they know the gap with Australia is growing wider by the day and accelerating. And we've got that from Statistics New Zealand out today. Statistics New Zealand came out and said that the wage increase in the last year was 1.6%. Well, Mr. Speaker, inflation went up by higher than that amount. And every New Zealander going through the supermarket checkout knows that when John Key tells them that they're better off, that is not true. That is not true. And what else did we find? We found that the wage increases in New Zealand in the last year to June grew at half the rate of the wage increases in Australia. Half the rate of the wage increases in Australia. And most of all, we learned that the wage increase under this national government in the last year was, in the Statistics New Zealand report, well under half of what Labor gave workers in its last year of office. And that's where the truth lies, Mr. Speaker. Mr. English can talk as much as he likes about his legacy. His legacy was a country with one of the lowest rates of unemployment in the world, where wages had consistently been above prices, where people were better off in their workplace, in the social policies that were being pursued, and in their living standards. And you know, Mr English made a half-hearted attempt to say what his plan was. Well, this was the real plan. This was the national website today, Mr Speaker. This was the website. It's got the 2010 budget policy statement, building the recovery, national, building the recovery. And what does the policy say? Mr Speaker, it's a blank piece of paper. It's a blank piece of paper, Mr Speaker. Oh no, it's got a copyright on it. It's got a copyright on it. But this sheet of paper is as blank as the ideas and the plan that the National Party has to address the problems of this country. There is no plan, Mr Speaker. There is no plan. I've got to say that mining in a national park or a protected conservation area isn't a plan. It isn't a plan. John Key, Kate Wilkinson and Jerry Brownlee told the House at the start of this session that was their big plan for step change. They were going to dig up our national parks. They were going to dig up our national parks. Ask anyone in New Zealand, any New Zealander, and they'll tell you that that was a load of nonsense economically and it was a load of nonsense environmentally. And now they slunk away from that policy with their tail between their legs, John Key denying that he'd ever had anything to do with it. But the truth is, Mr Speaker, we wasted 6 months when this government should have got a plan to lift New Zealand wages, to lift New Zealand employment and to actually close the gap. Mr Speaker, when I asked the Prime Minister in the House today if he had the courage of his convictions and the promise that he made, would he set benchmarks by which progress towards that objective of 2025 could be set? And the answer was no. No, there was no courage of convictions. What we know is that promise to close the gap with Australia was simply empty electoral rhetoric. There is no plan. We are not catching up. It is getting worse. The gap is growing. For the first time in more than a decade, we have higher unemployment than Australia. Higher unemployment under John Key's watch. We have higher unemployment than in Australia. And when challenged this afternoon in question time as to whether he would predict that the employment gap with Australia would narrow, he declined to make the prediction. Because I'll tell you why, Mr Speaker. The Department of Social Welfare statistics already show that our dole queues were growing bigger while the Australians were cutting down their unemployment. And the projections this week is that that will continue. Mr Speaker, you don't have to be a rocket scientist to know what New Zealand actually needs. It's pretty clear how we can move forward, and what's pretty clear is also in Labor's plan. Labor's plan, Mr Speaker, is about upskilling the workforce. Because we know we need more apprentices, not less. We know there's a looming skills shortage, but this government is doing absolutely nothing about it. We know we need more people with tertiary education, but they're locking out an unprecedented 5,000 people. We know we need to achieve better in education. Standards don't achieve anything more, they measure it. What achieves better standards is better early childhood education. But that's what they're cutting, Mr Speaker. That's what they're cutting. We know we need more savings, because if we save more, we invest and we own and control our own country. So why then did National cut KiwiSaver when the Australians were expanding their scheme? Why did the National Party cut the money that was going into the Cullen Super Fund so the baby boomers could contribute towards their own retirement? We've got less savings because of what that government is doing, and they can whine all they like about being tenants in their own country. They're causing it because they don't have a plan for savings. And, Mr Speaker, we know we need to invest in a smart economy. You're not going to catch up with Australia by making workers worse off, by cutting their entitlements, by cutting their wages. You're going to catch up with Australia and do well by a smarter economy, smart